Hi, George.
Hi,
how you
everyone.
going?
Hi, Anna. Hi, everyone. It's look, thank you for joining us and welcome to our webinar. So this is risk mitigation for your SaaS business. I'm Georgina Toomey, so I'm a practice group leader in the corporate team at LegalVision, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by Anna Parker, who is head of Auckland and senior insurance broker for Frank Risk Management. So thanks for joining us, Anna.
Thanks for having me. Awesome to be here.
Now, before we begin, we're just going to run through a few housekeeping matters. So firstly, you will be emailed a copy of this webinar recording later today. So we'll also be doing a Q&A at the end of the session. So if you've got any questions for either Anna or I, you can submit them in the chat box. I would also be really grateful if you could complete the survey at the end of the webinar as well. Also, all attendees are welcome to contact us for a legal consultation to discuss how we can help you with your particular legal needs, and to request this, provide us with your contact details in the survey that appears at the end of this webinar. We're also very happy to forward through any requests for a consultation with Anna as well for your insurance queries. So on to the content portion of the webinar. Today we'll be discussing how to mitigate risk for your SaaS business. We'll start with a brief discussion on key risks that we see for SaaS businesses, and then we'll focus on risk mitigation strategies that you might want to employ in your business from both a legal and insurance perspective. To help contextualise that discussion, we will be using a case study business, which we'll keep coming back to as a common thread throughout our webinar. And then we'll finish with a quick wrap up around, we'll just look at the current New Zealand environment and how that's relevant to our discussion today. So our case study, our business today is Watercooler. So Watercooler creates bonding and communication solutions for remote working teams. It's been 18 months since launch and it's operating via a single company structure. Now, the founders have been bootstrapping the business to date, and they're now preparing for their first capital raising round. During recent testing, the developers have uncovered a vulnerability which was flagged and resolved, with basically a major potential data breach avoided. And this has spurred on the management team to undergo a legal and insurance health check before starting investor DD. So, Anna, I'll briefly pass over to you now. In your view, what are the key risks that Watercooler needs to be wary of in this context?
Yeah, we are going to go into detail later on, so this is just a high-level overview, but it's the failure of products, third-party risks. Something that is really important to remember is that not all risks are insurable, and the best insurance policy is always going to be proactive management of the risks that you see on the screen. Another big one is, of course, site availability. So if you're providing a piece of software as a service, you need to make sure that the site, you have a really good hosting provider and they have an incredible track record for uptime. AWS is one of them. They basically never go down because you don't want an outage, because any site going down, especially if you're selling software as a service, those other businesses are going to be relying on that tool as part of their business. That's a really big one. And also check contracts, because sometimes they might request 99% uptime. For example, privacy and data breaches, we're going to get onto later, disaster recovery and regulatory compliance. I think you had something to say on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, as Anna said, you know, a lot of this we will go into in a lot more detail coming up. The idea here is basically this is not a comprehensive list, but these are some of the key things that Watercooler and your usual SaaS businesses will need to be thinking about in the context of this discussion. So in terms of how does Watercooler mitigate these risks, we'll be taking again a two-pronged approach here and looking at risk mitigation strategies from both the legal and insurance point of view. So regarding insurance, Anna will be discussing specifically tech liability, cyber liability and D&O policies. And from the legal perspective, I'll be looking at the need for really good internal policies and procedures, creating business-specific contracts for third-party commercial dealings, as well as really quickly touching on your corporate structure. So moving on to your legal risk mitigation. So starting off here, the first piece that we need to be looking at are your internal policy documents. So your regulatory environment means that you need to really carefully consider data privacy, consumer protection, and financial regulation in each jurisdiction that your headquarters are based, and also any jurisdiction that you're looking to reach into. In particular, there is a framework of New Zealand data protection laws that watercooler and any SaaS business is going to need to ensure compliance with. All countries do have different and increasingly onerous data protection regimes, and there's also an increased focus on cross-border transfers of data. So it's a really important area. So watercooler needs to ensure that it's got a privacy and data protection policy in place. And this and the company's kind of back-end processes all need to ensure that they comply with your legal requirements and normal regulator expectations on that front as well. Now, often wrapped into this is your security policy and processes. So cybersecurity is an increasing issue, and particularly in regards to risks that are related to cyber attacks, which are increasingly frequent in this space. And your policy does need to address what happens in the event of, say, a security incident. Now, the internal version of this policy will basically allow your team to understand how cybersecurity fits within their day-to-day work practices. And you may also want to consider having an external facing policy as well, which is available to your customers and suppliers so that they can understand how you will be looking after the data that's shared with you. So you need to be thinking about things like how are systems accessed, how do your users authenticate themselves. So we're looking at things like password policies and two-factor authentication there. What are your device use policies, and how will you encrypt data? Will you encrypt data both in storage or at rest, as well as all your data in transit as well? Now, given the continued sort of evolution in the space of SaaS platforms, you do need to make sure that those policies are flexible, and because they do need to continually be reviewed to keep up with that changing environment. And the key piece there is no one size fits all. So you do need to make sure that your policies and processes are fit for purpose for your particular business and the environment that you're working within. And you can look to talk to a data protection lawyer who can help you basically run an audit of your data and security protection practices internally, and make sure that you are compliant.
George, I've got a question. George, what are you seeing in the current environment? Do you think that businesses are taking the contracts seriously from the start? I remember from my litigator days, there would be so many contracts that didn't have much attention at the beginning, and that would end up in litigation and all sorts of problems. So do you think that customers and clients are getting a bit more savvy about it all, or what do you kind of see out there?
Yeah, look, I think particularly in the startup space, we see a lot of people taking an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff approach. They've often proven a really successful product. It's launched, it's had a lot more traction early on than they expected, and then they're quickly trying to backfill with these robust policies in their contractual requirements because there's been, a near miss or there's been an issue. So I guess the emphasis there, and I'm sure it's the same from an insurance perspective, is it's a lot better to do these at the start and have a chat, get the systems and processes in place, get them right, and then you're going to be able to manage that risk a hell of a lot better. And of course, your lawyer's going to be telling you that we are risk averse, but look, we do see plenty of examples of where it goes wrong.
Definitely nice.
And that leads us nicely onto the external facing documents. So, what Watercooler can next look at is what you've touched on, Anna, is, okay, so what's your third party risk management processes, and how can you mitigate potential risk through your contracts with your suppliers and your customers? These contracts are really important to basically set out both the commercial terms of the arrangement that you've got with them, but also to help limit your liability. So, for example, say with your supplier contracts, the key thing here is to ensure that your suppliers delivering the services that they say they're going to, and that they complete it to a high standard. Then you also need to be looking at what warranties you're getting from them to basically make sure that they take responsibility for any errors in their work and any loss that may impact your business. So say you've got a software developer that's helping with the creation of Watercooler's website. You know, what happens if they steal code from another website and use it on Watercooler's website? Watercooler gets sued for infringing copyright. You need to make sure that that supplier is then held responsible rather than Watercooler. So the sorts of key other sort of matters that you want to be thinking about betting into those contracts are, you know, who owns the IP that's brought to that relationship and who owns the IP that's developed in the course of that relationship. What information shared is considered confidential, and how far can that confidential information go? Are there clear privacy obligations and acknowledgements by each party? And then, you know, for anyone processing data on your behalf, have you got built in there clear parameters around ownership of the data, how it's going to be used, and how it's going to be protected? So the key kind of piece there is that you need to be making sure that you're back-to-backing those contracts. So if your customers are being promised something, can your suppliers deliver it? Where are the gaps? And that's where your risk sits. And you also need to be making sure that you're striking a really good balance between getting what you want from a risk protection point of view and also just getting the deal done. So you don't want to be negotiating these contracts every time. You want a fairly balanced document. And so we typically recommend, again, it goes to that point that you raised, Anna, is set up those basically templates from the outset that you know are appropriate for your business. They will get negotiated from time to time, that's fine, but at least you know that you're starting off at a really good point. The other thing is that, you know, sometimes the bargaining power of the parties means that you have to put up with using the template documents of the counterparty. The key thing to be aware of there is just be aware of your cookie cutter contracts. So make sure that it's appropriate for your business and this particular commercial relationship. And a key flag in the context of this discussion is what are the insurance requirements embedded into that contract? Make sure you check them. You know, often we find that there are really onerous insurance requirements put in there that they aren't even appropriate for that particular business or that relationship. So that can come at a really significant cost to comply. So check them and get advice.
Yeah, and I see that a lot as well, that you are given a contract, you're really excited about this, and you think all these insurance requirements, and you think you have to instantly obtain all of that insurance to meet that contract, whereas actually it's a bit of a negotiation, bargaining back and forward, that if they don't relate to your business or your risks or your exposures, then they're not necessary, and you need to push back on those requirements.
Absolutely, and even those kind of take it or leave it sort of discussions, there is always room to move and negotiate on really critical points like this. So do get advice. Any good lawyer or insurance broker is going to tell you, actually, you know, this is what you can and can't push back on, and this is what's reasonable and what's not, just to give you that information to help you going forwards. Now, I won't spend a huge amount of time on it because business structuring is a whole topic in itself. Now, while there's a number of ways to structure your business, what we'll do for the purposes of this kind of brief discussion is focus on the company structure because it is the choice of most fast-growing startups that you see in New Zealand. Now, the key benefit of this structure in the context of this discussion is the limited liability of shareholders. So if there's a claim made against the business, it will be against the company rather than the individual shareholders or founders. Now, so Watercooler here has started with a really simple company structure, which is great in the short term and to get the business going. But if your business is really high growth and potentially working in a high risk area, then you do need to be thinking a bit bigger than this. So what happens if something critical goes wrong? How can you protect your IP, assuming that that's a critical asset of the business? And how can you protect your company from potential business failure? So here you might want to be starting to think about a dual company structure, which is a really common tool used by companies to basically separate out your key assets and protect them away from your trading liabilities. The other things that you need to be thinking about there is your IP clearly owned by that holding company, and is it adequately protected? So, you know, look at your shareholders agreement, look at your employment agreements. Do they clearly set out that any IP created is owned by the company? Have you registered your trademarks? Have you protected your IP through those third-party contractual arrangements with people that might be able to have access to that IP? And then touching back again on those governance documents, you know, do they build in confidentiality obligations? Do they have ongoing restraints of trade? Do you have bad lever provisions in there? So say you've got a key developer who's consistently not complying with really key company policies and procedures, creating a huge risk to the business. They're effectively materially breaching their employment agreement. Have you got an ability to buy back their shares if they happen to be a shareholder as well? Things like that you can do again at the front end to try and protect your company and your business as much as possible. So again, while we can do a lot of work at the front end to mitigate that risk, the reality of owning a business is that things can still go wrong, which leads us into the key focus of today's session, which is, you know, how do we further protect ourselves through business insurance? So I'll pass over to you, Anna, who basically, Anna will discuss what insurances water cooler needs to be looking at and why, and potentially maybe, you know, what insurance requirements are overkill or not. So over to you, Anna.
Next slide would be awesome, yeah, thanks. So any startup company or established SaaS company, they get really excited about growth and scale, and they kind of forget any legal requirements and definitely insurance. I've never seen anyone really excited to go see a lawyer or really excited to go see their insurance broker and talk about insurance. However, I've seen things go very wrong, and I think that having the right things in place from the start, like a contract or your insurance, makes all the difference down the track, especially if you want that sort of confidence to grow, expand into other countries, and mitigate as much risk as possible. And I know we talked about earlier that all risks aren't transferable to insurance, and the most proactive thing is that you mitigate the risks that you know about, and then what you can transfer to insurance, you do. So one of the most important insurance policies for a company like Water Cooler would be a tech liability company, and that was created to cover the very specific needs of the growing IT sector. A really robust tech policy is going to have in it your professional indemnity, which covers your errors and admissions if you cause a third-party financial loss. Also, it's going to have media liability in there for infringement of IP, amongst other things. You're also going to have cyber liability, which we're going to talk about in depth later on. That will insure against serious breach incidents. And then your general liability if you suffer property damage. I think it's really important here to flag how big SaaS claims can get and how fast they happen. I know, for example, of an invoicing system that went wrong for 2 days and the claim was for over 90K. The scale of the problem is because effectively, as a SaaS, you are programming the brain of the organization. And if one part of that brain isn't working, it's all going to go wrong really fast. So I think people can kind of get a bit nervous around the cost of insurance. However, I've seen how fast claims happen, and you'll always think to yourself, I'm so glad I had that insurance policy, because it was the difference between your business surviving or not. On to the next. Now on to cyber insurance. This is another crucial policy. So either, as we discussed, you're going to have it as part of the tech liability. So that tech liability policy has a load of extensions under it, and you can extend it to cover cyber liability, or you have an insurer that doesn't extend to cover cyber, so you have a different standalone cyber policy. But they're both going to do the same thing, which is to mitigate your cyber risk. And something that's very important right now with cyber insurance is there are a lot of claims, and you really have to demonstrate to underwriters that you have a robust cyber security process in place. And I think that it's also very important to understand that SaaS companies are at risk of really expensive data breaches and cyber attacks. That's because they will normally hold quite a lot of personal data, and when those come under attack, the diagnostic cost of what went wrong with a SaaS can be really expensive. So, for example, most diagnostics, and diagnostics is when you get a cyber security expert, so you have a claim, something goes wrong or a breach, you have a cybersecurity expert that comes along and analyzes and diagnosed what happened, what went wrong with this moment in time or this claim, or how did it all happen, and they start to unravel it. And most of those diagnostics at the moment, they cost around 50k just to diagnose, and that's before you've even got into the start of the claim. That's before you've even got into the real crux of what the damages are, the settlement amount, all the rest of it. So if you've got diagnostics that are costing around 50k for big claims, then you can imagine the scale of the rest of it. Back to that data point, it really is important how much data is kept for another person and what that means around the privacy laws and what happens if you have an attack. So we're talking about passports, driver license, sometimes lease agreements. When that's been leaked, you have to notify each person that's had their data attacked, and the cost of notifying those people can be in the thousands, and that's where your cyber insurance policy would respond, because you get access to not only those cyber forensic experts that we talked about, lawyers, PR consultants, and in the first 48 hours of a cyber claim, that's when you really need that team around you that help, especially because of how big they can get. And yeah, going back to what I said earlier, cyber insurance is becoming really hard to get, and you do have to kind of demonstrate that you have all these security processes in place and give a lot of information. We joke that you almost have to prove you don't need cyber insurance to obtain cyber insurance at the moment. On to the next slide, there's a couple of examples which might help to make things a bit more clearer of what could happen. And so a system, you lose hundreds of records and the cost of that, and then a breach of your systems. Again, it goes back to talking about that PPI, that personal information, and what happens when that's attacked. And the problem with a SaaS claim in particular is because you really have to pull the layers apart to see how bad that problem is. I know of another claim which was a SaaS company that was part of a reward program, and they were using coupons, kind of like Uber Eats, and they ran a promotional program which was supposed to drive traffic to that particular promotion, but they had to sustain the service without it going down. And what can you imagine happened? The system, it couldn't sustain that level of high volume of traffic, and it went down because of that service failure. If you're talking about a normal site that might have, let's say, 100 people visit it, and then suddenly you've got this promotion where thousands upon thousands of people are visiting that site, you really have to make sure that you've tested your system, that it can handle all those extra people. Because with that claim, overnight, there were 1,500 claimants that had suffered a loss because of what happened. So we really tell people to be very careful with promos, and you test the system again and again and again in the network, because appreciating how high the traffic could be during that promotion. On to the next slide, please. So we just talked about two really important policies, which are your essentials. So if someone came to me and said, what are the essential policies? I have a SaaS company that I need. I'm always going to say tech liability and cyber. They are your crucial, you cannot operate without those policies. However, the reality is that as a SaaS company, you're going to want to grow, scale, get external investors. And what are external investors going to want? They're going to want you to have a directors and officers, or a D&O policy, as it's commonly referred to. And whilst I talked to a couple of other colleagues, we haven't come across any D&O claims in the SaaS space. So that kind of highlights how low risk that area would be for a SaaS company. It's not negligible, but it is a very low risk. However, like I said, if you want that external investment, you are going to need directors and officers insurance, because any external funder, any person that wants to give capital is going to want to know that they have assurances from your company that they are protected as a director. And it is very unlikely that you will get investment without that being in place. But I think it's good to note that on the insurance scale, you would like to think that most of your premium and the cost kind of sits with tech liability and cyber, and then you have this additional D&O. But in my experience, I wouldn't expect it to be as expensive as the others. I mean, obviously it's all case by case, but yes, that's how I would operate for water cooler in particular. And the other policies here I've just listed out. And if you think on a ranking scale, so you've got tech, cyber, probably D&O if you want some external investment, and most SaaS companies are going to want to grow. Well, all of these other policies exist. I'm really not going to go into what each of these policies cover. You can always reach out to me and have a conversation if you want to know, but there are some other policies that are out there. And one of the things I always say, that under-insurance is a problem, but so is having insurance that you don't need. So you really want to talk to someone who understands your particular business, your risks, and make sure that you don't have more insurance than is necessary, because I think there can be a real risk of going near someone and they just throw everything at you, and that's just not necessary. And I think we talked about that earlier as well with the contracts as well, that it is case by case, it is your risks and your exposures that you're trying to get insurance for.
And just jumping in there, we've had a question come through. At what stage of growth should a startup consider taking out insurance?
Yeah, really good question. So with insurance, you always need to jump to the worst case scenario. What is the maximum probable loss that my company or what I'm doing, the services that I'm providing, what is the maximum probable loss that could happen? So if you think doomsday scenario, which is some of the things we talked through right now, then you arguably would say you need insurance from the very start. From the moment you start the business, you need to go. But if you're not live, or if you're in a testing environment, if you're not in control of third-party data, if you're not dealing with third parties, then do you really need insurance when you're in that sort of incubator testing stage and nothing's gone live? I don't know. You can get insurance for R&D, and I think it would kind of depend. But also, say there was a massive loss. A lot of these startup companies, let's say they're run by a 20-year-old. You cause this loss, but you don't really have anything to go after. You don't really have personal assets. You don't really have a house. You've kind of got nothing to lose. So I don't know. I think it should be taken really seriously around getting insurance, but I also think it's a discussion that you have with a lawyer early on as well as an insurance broker, and say, yep, a broker's suggesting all those policies, but have a chat with a lawyer and say, look, if something went wrong, actually, where am I exposed? What is my liability? And do I need insurance right now in this stage? I think that's something to be really mindful of.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really relevant comment, because I think with, given the amount of volume of information that's available to people online now, we often get clients coming to us pre-launch. And they're relatively green, they're relatively young founders, and they've come to us with ideas of they want complex dual company structures, they want to put trusts in place, they've overcomplicated it, protecting against a risk that once you dive into it, you actually realize there's very little risk there anyway. So what I can say is, you have that chat to someone who can advise you on and kind of dive into what your particular situation is and work out a sensible approach, which is not throwing everything at it, but is suitable for your business. And so it's, as you said, Anna, completely just as relevant from a legal perspective as it is from an insurance perspective. And it's very easy to overcomplicate things, rack up your costs before you've even launched, and basically hamstring yourself before you even get going. So it's a really important discussion to be having.
Yeah, nice. On to the next slide, please. Cool. So there are lots of strategies that water cooler in particular can take when looking at insurance, and I put a couple of really important ones on the slide ahead. But from my experience, obtaining insurance can either be really straightforward and loads of insurers want the business, it's really competitive, the premiums are really competitive and the terms are as well, or it can be incredibly challenging, incredibly difficult with not many insurers offering capacity, or they just don't want to write the risk. And I think that's kind of a difficult one when you're dealing with those startups who are so excited to get going, they don't really understand why no one wants to offer insurance for their risk. It's because an underwriter has looked at that risk and deemed that the losses that would suffer, and back to what we talked about, how quickly SaaS claims start to happen and unravel, they've decided that that risk is either so risky and so probable that something's going to happen that they're going to put a premium on it that makes it really prohibitive for those companies to obtain insurance, or they're going to ask so many hurdles and questions that you kind of put up a load of barriers to obtaining insurance in the first place. So I think you kind of have to be very proactive around how you obtain insurance. And one of the things that we talked about is the proposal forms. So when you obtain insurance, you will be asked to complete a proposal form. That proposal form is the bare minimum that a SaaS company should be providing to their broker, which will then ultimately negotiate with an underwriter, because underwriters want to see things like your traditional terms and conditions, the privacy statement. They want to see that listed on the website, and they want to know that you are addressing privacy concerns. They want to see what your service actually is. They want to see software license agreements and contracts of service. Are they being modified, for example, for specific clients? Is this SaaS plugging into a really high risk occupation? So things like, is it going into financial services, medical technologies? You've got to give them all this sort of information. One of the most valuable things I work with alongside clients is I get them in front of the underwriters, because they are the person that knows their business the best, and you want to be able to have the opportunity to present that business to an underwriter. So an underwriter can ask you all the questions around your business, they can understand, and we have these kind of amazing conversations together where we're really unpicking the exposures, the liabilities, and the underwriters come back feeling very comforted, because ultimately you want to give an underwriter a lot of comfort, because that comfort is going to equal lower premiums and better terms. And I would say that the number one thing, so you can give all the information, you can do everything, but the number one thing is, where possible, get in front of an underwriter and have those sorts of discussions, because there's nothing like hearing about a business from the person who created it and who runs it. It is extraordinary to hear that story. And plus, you know, we all get excited by those businesses anyway, so we want to hear the story regardless.
Yeah, look, that's actually answered a number of questions along the theme that we've had around what do underwriters actually look for from you when you're looking to get insurance. The flip side of that as well is, you know, that's what underwriters are looking for. What about the other side? So we've got a question here saying, what should I look for when I'm choosing an insurance broker or insurer? Great question.
So coming from my lawyer's background, the reason why I became a broker was because I passionately disagree with any broker being paid by commission. So you really want a broker that isn't paid by commission, that operates on a fee for service or an hourly rate or whatever their structure is, because when you are talking to a broker in particular, you want to know that they're only giving you the insurance that you need for your business, and that they're not trying to upsell because they're going to make a load of commission off the back of that advice. So it's really important to find a broker that isn't paid by commission. I think that's the number one thing. And also, if you have a claim, you want to know that your broker is acting for you as your advocate and is not being paid for by an insurer, which, as you can appreciate, is a pretty major conflict that happens there. So that's a very important one. And also a broker that has experience with other tech companies. So you want to know that when you're talking to a broker, they understand the world of what are devs, what's software, what's a testing environment, what's the data I hold, what's a contract, how do they relate to my software license agreement, how do they all talk together, all those sorts of things. So you kind of want a broker that has a bit of expertise as well in that area, especially given how technical technology liability can be.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, well, I'm conscious of time, but what I've been doing is basically I'm building in the questions as they come. So do keep bringing in the questions. We'll build them in as much as we can. But look, there probably won't be a formal Q&A at the end of it, because actually a number of the questions are relevant to this current slide as well. So look, Anna, obviously New Zealand, we've had a horrendous few weeks with Cyclone Gabrielle. Keen to hear your thoughts on what impact do you see that having on insurance in New Zealand going forwards? And you know, is that going to be relevant? Is it going to impact businesses such as SaaS businesses, or are they going to sit outside potentially a tougher scheme to work within? What are your thoughts on that front?
Yeah, the cyclone will definitely have an impact on premiums, and I think it's a really good time now that there are lots of regions that have been affected by the storms and lots of regions that haven't. So if you have not been affected by a storm, then I think it's a really good time to assess your current insurance, take stock of what you need, not only from a commercial space, but also the personal side, and understand that there are many different ways to transfer some of that risk, and not all policies are created equal, and you kind of want some really solid advice around your whole insurance world, because you don't want to be overspending. You want to make sure that your money is working for you and that you're putting it into areas of insurance that you need, where you have those risks and exposures that we talked about. So I think it's a really good time to look at your whole insurance world right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And the comment there around the kind of current market and investment potential. So again, Anna's touched on this, you know, when we're talking about D&O insurance and requirements of investors, there's quite a lot of, I guess, doom and gloom currently around, you know, difficulty in raising capital in the current market. And we thought it was worth commenting on that. So look, there is a softening in the market, but the reality is there's still money out there for excellent businesses with an exciting product. So what we are seeing is basically investors seeking more investor-friendly terms. A lot more, they're looking for a lot more protection against downside risk, as you would expect. Things like D&O policies, that's just a no-brainer regardless of the environment. So these are the sorts of things that you should be expecting. And in terms of the impact that that's having, is often it means that we're seeing that companies are looking to raise only what they need in the short term in the hope of there being a bit of a recovery in the market. But look, it doesn't mean that nothing's happening. There's certainly some exciting capital raising going on and a lot of support from VCs out there as well. So that's definitely you know, something to be thinking about. And again, all of this discussion today around front footing, potential risk in your business, that's the kind of stuff that your investors are going to do due diligence on. They're going to be asking you these questions to the extent that you can easily table, you know, your systems, your processes, your policies, your template documents, your insurance that you've got in place. That's all seen very, very favourably by investors. So you are really doing yourself a favour to front foot those questions.
Definitely. And it all feeds back into that discussion of comfort, that when you take all those documents to an underwriter, or when you take all those documents to an investor, it just leads to this, oh, they're really onto it. They're onto their legal requirements and they're onto their insurance. So I have a lot of comfort now that I would like to invest.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other comment there in terms of, I'm sure everyone is absolutely aware of it, but this really increased focus on ESG. So from a corporate perspective, there's a focus here by both your investors and from a board governance perspective in terms of your requirements there. So, and again, the past couple of weeks have shown us that there is, you know, a real climate emergency, real climate issue here. So you can only expect that this focus will increase. And investors are also really keen to see that it's not just companies paying lip service, but they really want to see kind of real actionable change. And look, there's a lot of advisors out there that can help guide you through putting some formal kind of policies around that for your particular company too. So again, just something to be aware of in the current environment. So look, that ends the formal content section of our webinar. Now you might find our New Zealand Startup Manual useful. Again, a cautionary tale, there's a lot of information in there. Make sure that you don't overcook things without coming and talking to someone. But look, you can download that with the instructions on the slide there. Now, we've also got an upcoming event that might be of interest to you, starting a business in New Zealand, so lessons from Beanie's founder, and that's being held on Tuesday, the 14th of March. Now, LegalVision, a quick touch on our membership. So basically, we've got some really high level information there. It's a really cost effective alternative to those hourly rates that you experience with other law firms that both Anna and I are very familiar with. So basically, for a fixed monthly fee, you will get cost certainty as well as all the all-inclusive legal services that are listed on that slide. The idea here is that basically we liken that membership to having your own in-house counsel. We'll take care of the business as usual legal work, and you can focus on running your business. Now, more importantly, Anna's details are showing on the next slide. So if you want to reach out to discuss your insurance needs in light of the conversation today and Anna's comments, I really encourage you to reach out to Anna direct or via LegalVision, and we can arrange that for you. Great. Well, that's all that we have time for today. We are skipping the Q&A because we have embedded it throughout, and I'm afraid we have run out of time. But look, it's great to see the engagement from everyone here. So look, don't forget to request that consultation if you want one when the survey appears at the end of this webinar. And otherwise, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Anna, for your excellent thoughts and contributions.
Happy to help.